I call the honourable member Chris Hipkins.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Mr Chair, I want to take a brief call to follow up on some of the comments the Minister just made about state sector reform and how this bill fits in with the government's wider agenda for state sector reform. I think this bill is quite different from a number of other aspects of the government's state sector reform agenda. First of all, it doesn't involve putting Stephen Joyce in charge of something else, and I think that's quite rare. Most state sector reform under this government generally tends to involve the Joyce empire growing, while the other ministers end up being under-deployed. So this bill clearly doesn't do that. It puts some more functions under Tony Ryle's little empire, which, of course, as we know from reading in the paper, Tony Ryle doesn't play nicely with others, so he likes to have everything under his control in his little box. The Labour Party does support sensible reform in the state sector. We support reforms in the state sector that make the state sector more responsive to the New Zealand public. And we believe that the public sector can certainly be better and can certainly deliver services in a way to the New Zealand public in a way that are more timely, more efficient and more effective, and we would like to see the public sector more focused on outcomes. We don't agree that in large part, the government's agenda for state sector reform is achieving that. It's in fact doing quite the opposite in many areas. It's not leading to greater efficiency. In fact, it's leading to greater inefficiency. And the best example of that is the arbitrary cap on the number of people employed by the public service. Because what we're seeing is that that's resulting in a massive increase in the spending on consultants and contractors. But that is an issue for another day rather than for the debate on this particular bill. But I do just want to underline the fact that we in the Labour Party do believe in reform of the state sector. We will support initiatives to reform the state sector where they do lead to better outcomes for the public and the more efficient delivery of public services. And that is why we are willing to support this part of this piece of legislation. We'll talk more about parts 2 and 3, the further parts that we're less supportive of. But in this particular part, we support it because there has been a call for greater integration amongst the agencies working in the public health area, and we believe that this bill will go some way to delivering on that. We actually do support, if we move to new section 58, the objectives of the new health promotion agency. We think that those are good things for the government to be focused on, promoting and encouraging healthy lifestyles. We do believe in preventing disease, illness and injury. I think that last bit about preventing injury is something that we should think a little bit about how that fits in the context of the government's other reforms, where we've seen the government within ACC actually taking the focus away from injury prevention within ACC. And actually, I think that's one of the big mistakes of the national government's public sector reform agenda has been removing that real emphasis on injury prevention from ACC. I think, and seems to stand in contrast to what this bill is trying to achieve. Moving back to new section 58, enabling environments that support health and healthy lifestyles, and giving advice and making recommendations on the misuse and harm of alcohol. Again, things that we in the Labour Party certainly support, and we think that those are worthy roles for the government. Of course, coming back to the first one, promoting health and encouraging healthy lifestyles, I remember not that long ago, maybe 3.5 years ago, the National Party, the then National Opposition, coming to this House. I wasn't a member of it at the time, but I was a follower of Parliament, and decrying many of the public health initiatives of the last Labour government as being nanny state. The nanny state had no role in telling people how to be healthy. Those were the sorts of things that the National Party were promoting back then. I'm pleased to see that they have seen the light, and they in fact now believe that there is a role, a positive role for the government in promoting health and encouraging healthy lifestyles. That is something that we in the Labour Party have believed in for quite some time. We have believed in the role of the government in public health and in preventative health measures, because we would far rather spend money to prevent people getting ill and to make sure people live full and healthy lives, rather than the Tony Ryle approach, which is to focus on all of the measures of performance when things go wrong. So what Tony Ryle has done is focus the health sector so much so on measures that, such as operations and elective surgeries and so on, rather than focusing the health services on preventative measures and on public health measures, which is Mr Chair.
I call the honourable member Chris Hipkins.
Thank you, Mr Chair, which is something that we in the Labour Party believe that the health sector should be focused on, far more on preventing illness rather than the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff approach, which Tony Ryle has done. The way he has politicised the performance measures of the health service, I think has been a real shame. There are elements of what he's done with the measures that I think have been good. However, I'm really concerned that those measures, those performance targets that he's put in place, have distracted attention away from wider public health measures, wider public health programs. So I hope that this new health promotion agency will go some way to restoring the balance there and will have the support of the government, because establishing an agency is all very well, but if it doesn't have the support of the government in its activities, then it's not going to be very successful. So I hope that the National Party, now having finally conceded that there is actually a role for the government in the promoting of health and encouraging healthy lifestyles and preventing disease, illness and injury, I hope that they will adequately support this agency, because so many of their other policies take preventing disease, illness, injury and promoting healthy lifestyles, changes they have made within schooling, within the education system, have gone in the opposite direction. We've seen a reduction in funding for healthy eating, healthy action, the HEHA programs in schools, which would seem to be in stark contrast to what this bill is trying to achieve. I visit the primary schools in my electorate all of the time, and I think one of the really positive things that primary schools are doing is planting vegetable gardens within the primary school, teaching kids about growing vegetables, about eating healthily. I think that's a really, really beneficial public health initiative that is supported by the education sector and that will lead to better longer-term health outcomes for all New Zealanders, teaching kids the value of eating healthily, growing vegetables. There's other advantages, of course, of teaching kids how to grow vegetables. I'm amazed at how many kids, up until the time when the school started planting vegetable gardens, wouldn't have had any idea where vegetables came from. So I think that's a very positive initiative. And the schools all tell me, in my electorate now, that they're struggling to get the funding to sustain those healthy eating, healthy action programs, like the growing of the vegetable gardens in schools. And we will pay the cost of that in the longer term if we have a less healthy student and child population. We will pay the cost of that in the long term. Preventing disease, illness and injury does involve government taking a proactive set of measures, proactive set of actions on a number of areas. If we're talking about disease and illness, we have to look closely at the link between disease and illness and poverty and people living in unhealthy houses. And I want to acknowledge that government haven't done everything wrong here. I think that some of the stuff they've done around better home insulation has been a very positive thing, and that's something that we in the Labour Party will certainly acknowledge, that having warmer, drier houses is good. However, we've still got a long way to go, and in the state housing area in particular, there is still a long way to go before we have people, all state house tenants, living in warm, dry, healthy homes. And I think that is something that, if we're talking about getting serious about preventing disease and illness, that is certainly something that we would like to see a much greater focus on within government. Finally, just to sum up on the issue of injury prevention, I do think that the ACC cuts that the government have introduced, where they've reduced the funding for injury prevention programs within ACC, have been a really bad step. They have taken us down a path that, in my view, is counter to what this bill is trying to achieve. And so I hope that now that there's been a change of minister within ACC, the letter writer is no longer there, and I hope that with him no longer in the way of making progress there, that we might see the ACC restore a bit more focus on injury prevention rather than simply being the ambulance at the bottom of the cliff. Thank you.
Mr. Chair.
I call the honourable member